This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where I'm delighted to chat with Susanna Grant, author of Shade and founder of the London-based shady plant shop, Linda. Susanna joins me to discuss shade-loving plants and how to bring life and vibrancy to those darker corners of your gardens.
So my background actually was, I worked in the music industry for a long time, so it has nothing to do with gardening at all. And I did that. And then I had kids, and then I became a freelance consultant. I was doing a lot of work, again, with the music industry, with festivals, with events. But during that time, I just really enjoyed gardening, but had no desire to do it as a job. But did like going to nurseries a lot. And I had one mate who also really liked going to nurseries a lot. So we would just take our kids and go and visit sort of nurseries within the southeast and just go and look at plants, which was quite random. But when I look back on it now, I do think there's a similarity, because I always really liked quite niche records and quite niche labels. And I think it's just, you see a plant, you haven't seen it before, and then you get really excited, and then you meet someone else and they're really excited about it. And I think there actually is an overlap in those two industries, weirdly. But I just gardened myself, and I had like a typical, very shady, small back garden in London. And just found that I wanted to do that more and more. So then I'd say to friends who had gardens, can I come with you to a nursery and buy some plants for your garden? Because, they were buying the wrong things. And they'd be like, yeah, sure. So I just did that a lot, and eventually just started planting people's gardens. For about 5 years, I was doing it really side by side with working in music. So it was a kind of quite a weird, I'd be at a festival and then have to come back, organise a load of stuff, and then go and plant people's gardens. And it was quite a random way of getting into it. But I then ended up going to Capel and doing some qualifications, and then just sort of found I was so busy that I just stopped doing the music thing and just ended up doing this all the time, which I'd sort of resisted initially, because I thought, well, it's something I really love. I don't want to turn it into a job because I might not like it as much, but actually it's been fine.
Is design the kind of main part of what you do now?
Yes, I suppose it is. I'm not a hard landscaper, and I have no real interest in hard landscaping. So I try and do all my designs using plants as much as possible. And then I have a very good friend called Will, who's an amazing garden designer. And then I have to beg him, if I need to make a path, which is about the most hard landscaping I like to do, I ask him to come and make me a really beautiful path. So yeah, it is design, but it's specifically with plants as much as possible. I'm not a big kind of putting in loads of decks, and I like to put all the planting really, really close to the house to make the people who live there go out through the garden to get anywhere. So yeah, I suppose so.
Okay. So you've also written a book as well, alongside your design stuff. Can you just tell me briefly what that's about?
Okay, so that's called Shade. And I had a few people ask me to write books, because I set up an Instagram account sort of doing loads of shady planting, because I just thought they didn't know what to plant, and then they thought they were rubbish at planting. And I thought if I could kind of show them stuff that worked, it would encourage them to plant up areas that they were just sort of dumping stuff in. And I got asked to write a few books from that, and they were all sort of slightly coffee table-y things, or kind of like definitive books on shade. And I didn't feel qualified or interested to do either. And I just felt like there were enough books like Beth Chatter, I didn't want to sort of start saying, oh, I've got more to say than she does. And then, so I said no. And then Zena from Bloom, which is a lovely magazine, she got in touch and said, would I write a handbook? And I thought, yeah, because actually there was something about that. I thought that might be more useful. That actually might be something that's quite useful. And there was something about the handbook thing rather than this big weighty manual. So I said yes. And then it was lockdown. So I was quite pleased I said yes, because it gave me something to do. I mean, ultimately, it ended up, I kept thinking this really should be just one paragraph, because I kept coming to the end of chapters and just saying, but really just try it. Just put in what you want to try it, because sometimes it will grow. And then I just decided I wanted it to be a huge list of plants, because I thought that would be really useful. And in the end, it became a bit of both. And then I also put in, I can't remember, 4 or 5 real gardens that we had to try and photograph during lockdown, which was quite hard, so that people could see plants in situ. I mean, it is a kind of book that's probably more useful for people who live in cities, because it's just about how to garden with as much biodiversity as possible in a small shady space, which so many London gardens are.
And taking it back to basics, how do you classify shade?
Oh, so basically, I mean, full shade is probably less than 3 hours. Most people have part shade, which means, you have like, say, 4 to 5 hours in either the morning or the evening. And I think that's quite important to look at your garden, look at those aspects of it, because if you have sun all afternoon, even though it might be 4 hours of sun, that's really warm sun. So you could grow pretty much anything in terms of light in that sort of environment, whereas morning sun is a lot weaker and not nearly as strong. And there's a courtyard that I garden that I used to sell plants out of, and that was total shade because it was a big development they put up that took all the shade away from it. But it was also really open. It was shade, but it wasn't like you didn't have a huge shadow coming across it. It was just sort of open shade, which a lot of gardens have as well, which means they're actually quite bright. And again, it's surprising how much will grow in there. And often what happens is you put in plants that say full sun on their label, which are always such broad brushstrokes, aren't they? And then you find that actually, sometimes I find plants are really improved because in the full sun they'd be really bushy, but in the shade or in bright shade, they become much more leggy or etiolated, so like kind of stretched out. And I find make much nicer shapes, especially for shrubs and things in pots. So yes, I mean, there is, if you go to the RHS, it'll tell you very set amounts of hours per shade, but I would say like full shade is sort of 2 to 3 hours of sunshine a day, which is pretty much full shade.
And are there common characteristics of all shade plants, or do they just come in all shapes and sizes?
They do come in all the shapes and sizes. And as I say, you can try lots of different plants that might say full sun that are pretty good in part shade. But I would say that you don't tend to get like the hot colour flowers. The foliage tends to be darker. You don't get that nice silvery foliage. So often you go to sort of a woodlandy scheme. It's more the flowers are often a bit smaller and maybe more subtle in colouring. And you kind of have to work a lot more with foliage shapes. But there is tons of choice. There really is tons of choice. And there's tons of things for pollinators. So there's grasses that work in shade, there's perennials, there's evergreens, there's trees. So you have like all the different, you can do a forest garden in the shade. It's just, you just really need to look for things that don't require 5-6 hours of sunlight. But yeah, I'd say that it tends to be more delicate planting.
I'm glad you mentioned flowers, actually, because I was going to come on to that, because I think there's a conception that people have that they think, well, actually, if I've got shade, then that's it. I can't have loads of flowers or can't have a very floriferous space. But is that true? And, can you think of any good examples of the plants that would give you the bang for your buck when it comes to the flower inside of it?
Yeah, I mean, lots of people think that. And also I often go to people's houses and they just really nervously go, I don't like ferns. And I'm just like, yeah, no, it's all right. You don't have to have a fern. There's loads of other things. But I think things like Digitalis lutea, it's a pale yellow foxglove, it's an evergreen, so you get the foliage all year. Really pretty, stands up for ages, really pretty sort of structural plant, and then really lovely seed heads. And I think something called a lamium or vala, which is not for everybody. It's from the dead nettle family because it's kind of more leaf than flower. But it's one of those things, if you look really closely, the flowers are so pretty, but the bees go mad for it. And you can have that sort of dotted through your garden, and it's so good for wildlife. Well, there's actually a white one. Beth Chatterjee does a white one, but they're normally this sort of nice browny purple colour. They're quite subtle. I mean, hardy geraniums go forever, and there's tons that work in the shade. Passacarias like Amplexicornis, they're really good. As long as you've got a bit of moisture, they'll do shade really well and they flower for ages. Bulbs are particularly good, especially because a lot of people have shade from deciduous trees, which obviously is a different type of shade. If your shade in your garden comes mainly from deciduous trees, and there's loads of spring things like brunneras and loads of other things that flower that look lovely, but also all your bulbs, you can really pack out loads of bulbs that are going to look lovely and give loads of early pollinators food. So it's good to sort of know that if you've got, that's probably the moment your garden's going to sing. Actually, I'll tell you another one is really good, is the wood aster, Eurybia divaricata. That's a lovely late summer one that's so tough, like it can, grow in tree roots once it's established, and you've got lovely seed heads. It's really pretty starry white flowers, especially when the light's going low as well. Those white flowers in shady gardens are really lovely because they do sort of sing.
Yeah, and have you found anything that's surprisingly shade tolerant that's not actually known as such?
Yeah, like loads of stuff, because I've got a really small garden and I trial stuff all the time. And I've got a side return that I just bung loads of stuff that might be left over from jobs and all that. I want to see how it does. And I've got loads of Alphea cannabina, which is a sort of a very delicate, really tall pink mallow, which is full sun. I mean, it does self-seed, but I've got a small north-facing bed where it must be over 2 meters. It's like way too big for the space, but it's lovely. And in my side return, it looks great. I mean, that's just like one thing. There are so many that I just think, well, I'm going to put it there and see how it does. Actually, another really good plant for shade is the Korean celery, Dicetania takismana. I'm not actually no idea how to say that, but it's an edible celery. I haven't eaten it. It's a big umbellifer, but it's absolutely beautiful with beautiful filigree green foliage. That's in my side return as well. Really tall, big, lovely, lacy plant.
It's interesting that you say about edible as well, and going back to what you said about being good for biodiversity. I think that's another thing that people maybe feel that shade gardens aren't quite so good for, because you don't have that proliferation of flowers. But in what ways can you help wildlife with a shade garden?
But I think in the same way that you can do it in other gardens, in the sense you can have water, you can have like wood piles, you can have, all those sort of habitat things, not leaving it too messy. But also like as long as I think just try and diversify the flower heads, so you have different things, like open cups or flat. I mean, I find Achillea, just a common yarrow Achillea, that will grow very happily in shade, and that's a great plant for pollinators. Obviously foxgloves are, but to try and have things flowering all different times of the year, and you can get every single sort of really type of flower head that would work. So I think it's just the same as you would do in any other garden. I think it's as much to do with creating habitats for them and not tidying away, not raking all your leaves away, and always making sure you've got, even if it's a tiny, like a saucer of water or just some water somewhere for pollinators to drink from. But there's nothing nicer than watching birds have a bath in a bird pond. It's so nice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like the idea of your side return where you kind of bung stuff.
Yeah.
You mentioned about trialing plants in your own garden. How else do you find new varieties to test? And on that point, do you think plant breeders are doing enough to produce plants that are shade tolerant, or are they always thinking about, oh, let's just go for the easy win for the, sunny spot?
I think they tend to go for the easy win. I remember going to Beth Chatham, which was years and years ago, and their shade plant collection was such a revelation, because it hadn't even occurred to me that, this was like years ago, that there was such things as dry shade, damp shade, and all these plants I'd never heard of. And it was such an eye-opener, and I just thought, this is amazing. And I think really there's still that nursery still has such an amazing selection. And there are like very small nurseries, there's more and more plants which do shade. There are like a few, but I think people do tend to go for the more exciting plants. And I guess if you haven't got a really small garden, you've probably got a fair amount of sun if you've got big gardens. But I find probably the most frustrating thing is that, one, there aren't nurseries in London. So, which would just be my dream, to try and find a space where we could set up a nursery and a tree nursery and start supplying, people properly. Yeah, I think that's it. It's just the access, because it's going to a nursery and talking to somebody who really knows their stuff is so much more helpful, because you can tell them, I've got this bit and it's under a tree and it's by this wall, what can I grow? And they'll tell you something that will grow. And I think if you live in a big city like London, it's ridiculous. You don't have access to those sort of people. That's why I ended up organising all these plant fairs, just so that people actually can go and buy really well-grown, healthy plants that are going to actually live in the ground rather than being hothoused.
I completely agree. So I'm going to think about some kind of real life examples now, because one of the things that people quite often come up against, either in their own gardens or in a design scenario, is that you get a garden, and this again is quite common, I think, in more urban areas. You'll have a garden, and as you look down the garden, one side of the garden is in shade and the other side of the garden is in light. And it's one of the most difficult things to kind of marry up those two different areas. How would you approach that?
Yeah, you're right. And it's the worst thing when you look like you've got two different gardens on either side. Well, I think two things. One, if I was going to design that space, I'd redesign it so that the planting wasn't on the edges. I'd always bring it in, so you'd have probably more of a middle ground. But also, there are just things that do survive very happily in a fair amount of sun, fair amount of shade. So there's like Strantias, they're pretty good. Japanese anemones are pretty good. Hydrangea quercifolia I use. Galenia trifoliata, geranium phaeums. There's a really nice grass called Chasmanthium latifolium. I think there's certain plants that I like. I mean, there's lots of plants, but there's certain plants I think that if you can always bring your planting in so it's not on the edges and you can see, and it sort of obfuscates the back of your garden so you can't see directly to the back. And two, there are just going to be plants that are going to, and they might kind of be bigger on the sunnier side than they are on the shadier side. But I think as long as you've got that repetition going through, and trees probably as well. I'm a really big fan of the spindle tree. I tend to put lots of sort of really skinny spindles. And again, they'll probably be quite happy being a woodland tree on both sides. But yeah, the key is just having some sort of transitional planting. And I guess it's probably, if I was a bit more knowledgeable on this, I'd be able to give you really clear examples of sort of woodland verge planting. But I think it is probably very much things that would thrive kind of on those edges. They get a fair amount of shade, but then a fair amount of sun. So naturally kind of progress into both areas quite happily.
And you mentioned trees, obviously. You've said the spindle. Have you got any other real star performers that you would go for?
I'm a big fan of hawthorns, all different kinds. I like Crataegus monogyna, but there's lots of different ones. I like spindle. I like an Amelanchier. I know like a lot of people are a bit sort of snobbish about them because they think they're really overused. But again, they're a woodland tree and they're just, if you've got a small garden and you've got something that will give you blossom and autumn colour and berries, you need things to work really hard, don't you? So that's a good tree. What else? I mean, sort of lots of things that really are probably technically big shrubs, which I guess an Amelanchier could technically be called a big shrub. I put it was a cornus, it's called a cornus angustata in a shady garden. That's looking really pretty at the moment. But again, I think I would look to woodland trees, and multi-stems are obviously useful because they tend not to get quite so big. And a crabapple, always a crabapple. That's a winner. I mean, I don't kind of go for really exciting, I don't know, specimen trees. I tend to like the more naturalistic looking ones.
Yes, there's a lot to be said for them. And I think you could definitely have a shady garden that was very, very tropical looking.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are, actually. But it's interesting to
They
think
are.
about you could have a more naturalistic shady garden as well.
There's a grass, Lusa, so it's a really useful evergreen, shady grass, really nice seed heads in the summer. You dot that around with, I don't know, some umbels like Sweet Cicely, and it's really easy to make a sort of woodlandy, meadowy kind of soft planting area. And also there's a fern, Dryopteris erythrosaura. My pronunciation is going to be totally off. Whenever I watch Gardener's World and I hear someone saying a plant, I'm like, oh, that's how you say it. But anyway, that Dryopteris, the sort of copper one, which is the new foliage is coppery pink, that takes a fair amount of sun. That's quite a good transitional plant. But that is, again, I think that's just a really lovely soft plant to have. And it gets you away from the really dark green, which you do end up using in shade garden quite a lot. But it's nice to have things that pop a bit more.
And is it easy to make it have year-round interest, or is that quite challenging?
I mean, I do plants, full sun gardens, but I actually think shade gardens are easier. I think there's enough going on from early spring bulbs to like late summer, like Japanese anemones and asters and other things like that, and hydrangea heads. There's enough going on that you can make them last all year, but you don't have the sort of intensity of the watering of like full sun gardens or the kind of maintenance. I think they kind of look a bit slower and a bit more gentle. I mean, I don't tend to do the sort of tropical gardens that you mentioned, and they do obviously work really well in shady spots and they look really nice in big courtyards, but I suppose they're mainly evergreens, and I'm not that interested in evergreens because they don't do that much. I like a garden that changes. I like seeing the sort of seasons. I like to provide gardens that do that. So I don't really work in that style.
And the other kind of challenging place sometimes in a garden, I think, is if you've got, for example, like a front doorstep or something, or another area where you've only got room for containers. Can you still do something in those that looks kind of good all year round?
Yeah, totally. I mean, my side return is all really big containers. I think that's the key is like, it's the size, like you just want something as deep as you possibly can. If you've only got like a windowsill or a back door, you can get the deepest container you possibly can because your plants will be so much more happy. They won't, dry out so quickly. They'll be able to put down decent roots. I'm trying to think what I've got in my side return. I've got a rose, actually. I've got a Rosa glauca, which is just about managing. I've got the Korean salad. This is like in one, probably like about a metre. I've got a few of these, but this one is a metre by 30 centimetres by about 50 centimetres tall. So it's 50 centimetres tall and 30 centimetres deep and a metre long. And that has this Korean celery, which is really tall, a Rosa glauca. It's got a white bleeding heart, which is gone for the time being. It's got tons of things that keep popping up. If I get a big container, I try and plant them as a garden. So I try and get something tall, something evergreen, a grass, something that will flower at different times of year, and bulbs. And you can fit a lot in those. I mean, I think that's the thing, especially for a window box, if you can get a really big window box, because you're so close up, you get to see the bulbs actually pushing through and you get to see all the leaves unfurling, and that's so nice. But you do need the depth. So I think I would just try and treat any container or pot as a garden and try and find things that work together. And you're always going to get something that's crowded out. But that's the same in a garden, and you can replace if it isn't working.
Absolutely. So I kind of had a little bit of a punt around at work today, and I said, has anyone got any pressing issues they'd like to raise regarding shade planting? And one of the things that came up that was quite interesting was something for a site that's really exposed in terms of wind. And we're coastal here, but, you know, that's not going to be your kind of neck of the woods so much. But if you had to pick something for shade that was going to get properly battered, what might you go for?
I'd certainly go for grasses. I would go like either the loose lanivia or, I mean, Calamagrostis Carl Forster, I think, is such a useful grass, and it can go to pretty much shade. That's tough. I mean, hardy geraniums would be fine, I think. The dead nettles, lamiums, are pretty good in dry shade as well. I'm trying to think of what grows in the roots of trees quite happily, because that's often a good...
Yeah, it doesn't get much tougher than that, does it?
It doesn't. It really doesn't.
And actually, on the flip side of that, do you ever come across really damp soils, particularly in urban locations? I'm guessing that's not as common, but do you?
Well, no, I do come across it quite. I mean, I literally did a garden the other day, and it was like, it's called gley. It's like that thick, almost bluey grey, like you feel like you could just stick it on a potter's wheel. So it's really nutrient rich, but there's an issue with the water. Obviously, like I'm worried, but I've done a few gardens like that, and I'm always worried that the plant's just not gonna survive and the soil's anaerobic. But they always do really well, and they actually get really big. So I guess that it's, you know, it's knowing things that like moisture, like Regersia or, I don't know, Persicaria really like it. Quite a lot of ferns like it. It's like things that really like that moisture around their roots and don't mind being, I think it's when it gets cold and wet is the issue, isn't it? So the roots don't rot off. So something like, I know it's a full sun plant, but something like echinaceas that people get really frustrated they can't grow in London gardens often. And I think they might have sun, but they've often got really deep clay soil and the roots just get really cold and wet and rot in the winter. And I often put grit in the bottom, obviously. But yeah, I think lots of things, I do come across that quite a lot. And most things do really well. It's just, as I say, it's just if they need free draining roots that it's not going to work for them.
I do think we struggle actually with plants for shade. I don't know if we've kind of got a bit of a mental block or if a lot of the time we're just wishful thinking and going, I'm just going to put that in because I'm going to pray that it lasts, and quite often it doesn't. But if you kind of could give one overarching pointer to people when they're looking to plant in shade, what would that be?
Well, if it's one point, I would just say you really need to work out how much shade you get, and probably more important, if it is dry or damp shade, because that makes such a difference. And then personally, I would use Beth Chatto's website as a reference. And if you think, okay, I'm pretty much full shade and it's dry, you know, you can look up plants using those parameters on the website. But I think it's just knowing, because it does make a massive difference if your shade's caused by a wall and it's really, really dry. You know, you need to know that something there is going to be quite happy, like an epimedium or something. It's probably going to be. Well, I think also the other thing is any plant, even if it says it can cope with dry shade, you really need to water them in properly to establish them, and then they're fine. You can't just bung them in a really dry spot and walk away and think it'll be all right. I think maybe people don't do that enough. They don't kind of water their plants in really properly, because once you've done that and the plant's established itself, it'll then find its way quite happily.
Thank you very much to Susanna for sharing all her shade gardening tips, and thanks to you for listening. If you like this episode, I recommend checking out episode 236, Mosses, and episode 23, Ivy. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.